This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website or domain, check out squarespace.com. Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Have you been checking out Canon's recent offerings and wondering if the new Canon R5 Mark II is the right camera for you? I had a chance to take it to Yellowstone National Park to try it out in winter conditions in the field shooting wildlife. And in this video, I'll share what I thought about it and how it compares to the original R5 and the flagship R1, both of which I've put through their paces. My name is Simon D'Entremont and I'm a Canon ambassador and professional wildlife and nature photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. I was speaking to folks at Canon recently and mentioned that I was going on a trip to Yellowstone National Park soon, and we discussed bringing the new Canon R5 Mark II along to try it out in real-world conditions. I've been using its predecessor, the original R5, since it came out, and I was looking forward to trying it out, wondering if it's the right camera for me. A very brief rundown on specs. The R5 Mark II has a new back-illuminated stacked sensor with 45 megapixels. For me in wildlife photography, that's about the sweet spot. Enough megapixels for cropping, but not so big that shooting several thousand shots in a day is a problem for file sizes. And these newer stacked sensors allow faster readout speeds. We'll see the benefits of this later in the video. It has two processors, speeding up autofocus processing and capture, and 30 shots per second RAW with the electronic shutter, and 12 frames per second RAW with the mechanical shutter, which it closes when you swap lenses, by the way, a great feature. It has a stabilized sensor with 7.5 to 8.5 stops of stabilization and a blackout-free display. Two card slots, one CF Express, which is what I use, and one SD, a UHS 2, which you can write to as a backup or use as an overflow card. But that's enough about specs. How did it do in the field? First, let's look at the overall design and handling. Like the R5, it feels great in the hand. Most of the buttons and switches are just like the R5, but the power switch was moved to the top right, replaced with a dedicated photo and video switch. This is a better arrangement, but interestingly, as a hybrid shooter, I'd like the old system as I could program the multi-function button in my original R5 to a one-button switch from photo to video and back. I'm sure I'll get used to this new setup, which is better for most. The camera worked great even in very cold weather, even if I've heard reports of people suggesting they had issues. I'm not sure what that's about, as I had no problems, including some mornings at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 17 Celsius. By the way, in the cold, turn on airplane mode to get better battery life by shutting down communications devices you don't need. Some other usability items to note include that you can charge this camera's battery through the USB-C port in case you forget your charger at home, which is great on the road. A reminder that you need a PD or power delivery charger to do this. The new battery is an LPE6P, same capacity but more juice for 8K, 4K, 120 and other features. If you shoot video, I'd get enough of the new batteries to meet your needs for a day's shooting, as you need the new battery for certain features. It also has a full-size HDMI port, which the original R5 lacked, which makes for a more robust dock for the cables I use to record the viewfinder with an external recorder, for example. The number one attribute of a camera for wildlife photography is the autofocus, and the R5 Mark II really shines in this department. It's hard to improve on the R5 as that was already amazing, but when I tried the R1 in Botswana and knew that the R5 Mark II shared much of the same autofocus system, I knew it would be great. The R5 Mark II is just that much faster to acquire and really sticky on the subject once acquired. I used the eye detection set to animal for my trip and it was great. The original R5 was already excellent on birds especially, but on mammals like elephants or rhinos with small eyes, it sometimes had a hard time finding the eye. On bison and other large mammals in Yellowstone, the R5 Mark II did a fantastic job on those big mammals. One tricky element was heavy snow. With 100% of the sensor being used, locking onto snow can sometimes happen when it's heavy. My workaround for this is that while I always use back button focus, I set the AF on as my regular back button using eye detection, but I set the star button as another back button and my failsafe. I set that to a single focus point which I can use to get focus through tree branches, through reeds in the grass, or through snow, which it cuts through like a laser. Awesome. I then switch back to the eye detection back button and it stays stuck to the subject afterwards. The other autofocus attribute I like is the simplified cases. Back on my 5D Mark IV, we had 6 focus presets, then 4 on my R5, and now just 2 in the R5 Mark II, which are customizable. The autofocus is just so good that that's all you need these days. Of course, for those of you shooting other genres, the subject detection is programmable to people, auto, wildlife, and sports. And in sports, you can even set up individual sports for it to use predictive analytics to figure out where the ball is going. That's crazy. You can even set it to find faces in a crowd. Great for a wedding photographer, I imagine. The next most important attribute for a wildlife camera is frame rate, how many shots it takes per second. For my tastes, 8 to 10 is about the minimum I like to have. The R5 Mark II has the same mechanical shutter frame rate as the original R5, 12, but the electronic shutter can do 30 frames raw per second, better than the former 20. The buffer is a bit deeper than the R5 as well, which was always good enough for me though. This is roughly 100 frames for electronic shutter and over 200 frames for mechanical. This leads us to one of the most important differences between the R5 and the R5 Mark II, the electronic shutter. I didn't use the E-shutter in the R5 for 3 reasons. One, it was completely silent, with only a flickering border to let me know I was shooting. I'd shoot 200 shots and hardly know I was taking a photo. 2, while the original R5 RAWs are usually 14-bit with a mechanical shutter, allowing better image quality, the electronic shutter on it produced 12-bit files, lesser quality. And 3, the slower readout speeds on the original R5 meant that in E-shutter mode, you could get an artifact on fast-moving subjects, like hummingbirds called rolling shutter. To note, this wasn't usually a problem. Most shots were okay, but once in a while you could get something like this. This is a function of the readout speed. The original R5's readout speed was 15.5 milliseconds. The R5 Mark II is 6.3. Given that for the original R5 this was rarely a problem, I'm very confident that this won't be an issue at all on the Mark II. Also, the R5 Mark II's E-shutter now shoots in a full 14-bit file, a higher quality. And finally, you can turn on sound for the electronic shutter so you really get a feel of how much and when you're shooting. This leads to one of my main observations about the camera. The electronic shutter is ready for prime time, and I plan to use it going forward if I get this camera. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you haven't heard of them, they're an all-in-one website platform that allows you to create your website from scratch, just like I did. You don't need any coding experience or even to be tech savvy. They have lots of templates to choose from to make it easy to get your own website up and running in no time. But even though they have great templates, like ones for photography for example, the place to go now is to use their new Design Intelligence feature, using both Squarespace's experience and cutting-edge AI, helping you to tailor your own website to your own specific needs. It looks really professional to have online galleries and your own domain, and a website is also a great way to monetize your work by setting up an online store using Squarespace Payments, which you can set up with just a few clicks. You can even do buy now and pay later with options like Afterpay. Go to squarespace.com to sign up for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Simon for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. How about sensor performance? As I've said before, it has a 45 megapixel sensor. This is great for deep crops like we sometimes do in wildlife and other action genres. So I can crop deeper than the R1 for smaller targets like birds or when they're farther away. The files look great, even when the light is flat. The noise performance and dynamic range in the field is indistinguishable from the original R5 in my experience. Here's my wildlife dynamic range test using the electronic shutter. A purposefully overexposed bison in the snow. If I drop this down 2 stops, then lower the whites, look at all the detail that's recoverable in the snow, even in areas that I was told by the blinkies were overexposed. Look at the smooth drop-off here between lighter and darker. If the dynamic range was poor, there would be a border between lighter and darker, not a gradual fall-off like we have here. And before you say that this area here is blown out, here's a properly exposed shot of the same scene, and it's just featureless snow. There's nothing there to recover. Here's a great example of a high dynamic range scene with the histogram showing bright whites as featureless snow and very dark darks with featureless shadows. But as you can see, if I lower the exposure, there's plenty of detail in the snow, and if I raise the exposure, there's plenty of details in the shadows, with solid image quality. As for noise performance, here's ISO 12,800, and I don't see any difference from the original R5. Now let's look at some other features that make my life easier as a wildlife photographer or make using the camera more productive. First, it has a great EVF at 5.8 million dots and a smooth mode for a high refresh rate, and it's also blackout free. It's the same resolution as the R5, but for some reason it looks better in the R5 Mark II. Maybe it's brighter, I'm not sure. Maybe the larger opening to allow for the eye tracking system makes it more comfortable. Metering also prioritizes the active focus points in the R5 Mark II, which was normally reserved for the 1DX and R1 series in the past. I'm not quite sure which combinations of subject tracking and metering modes control this, but the technical people at Canon told me this was the case. And some experiments of my own show that when in evaluative mode, the areas in focus impact the exposure more than the inactive focus points. A great feature. As mentioned, the camera's sensor has IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and it's the same system as the R1, 7.5 to 8.5 stops of stabilization. It works in combination with image stabilized lenses to work in tandem, great for hand-holding slow shutter speeds and super effective. Another feature that recent Canon editions, including the R5 Mark II, brought to the table was pre-capture. That means that you can capture photos that happen right before you hit the shutter button. What are you saying? What happens is that you turn the feature on, and when you half press the shutter button, it starts internally recording 1/2 second of photos. So with the ultrasonic shutter, that's about 15 photos. You know it's active by seeing the pre symbol up here. When you fully depress the shutter, it records the 15 pre-shots and keeps registering more photos. So here with this Fox interaction, you can see I have pre-capture enabled. And when the action starts, I hit the shutter button and watch. I not only capture the action, but I caught the start of the interaction before I even hit the shutter button. This is super useful for wildlife when you're waiting for some action to happen, but you don't know when it will happen. By the way, this camera also has eye control, not to be confused with eye detection. You program it to know where your eye is looking, and when you look around the viewfinder, the focus point moves to where you're actually looking. The problem is that I can't record the EVF while I'm using it, so I can't show you it working. But it does work, even for me that wears eyeglasses. I'm a hybrid shooter, so I need my camera to be a capable video camera as well. The R5 Mark II shoots in 8K RAW at 60p and 4K 120, which I love for wildlife. These are with no or very little crop, and in fine mode, you get 4K downsample from 6K and 2K downsample from 4K for great quality. And for overheating, for which the R5 was criticized for video, is now managed via some cooling vents, and you can even add a cooling grip. You can shoot 8K 30 for 26 minutes without the grip or 37 minutes with, which will also give you 4K fine at 60p for 2 hours. So in 4K, you can go a long time without overheating, so I'm not worried about it at all. Actually, I never even ran into an issue with the original R5. A great new feature is that audio is now available in slow motion modes where it wasn't before. On the R5, there's no audio if high frame rate is set for in-camera slow motion. But on the Mark II, if you don't enable high frame rate, you can get slow motion with audio. Of course, the audio will be shorter in length than the slowed down video, and the video won't play back in slow motion on your camera, but you have it in the file and you can use it as you wish. A nice feature for me, who loves slow motion for wildlife, but also wants the audio. And by the way, the R5 Mark II also has pre-capture for video. You have the choice between 3 seconds and 5 seconds, and yes, it works just great. Just wait for the action to start and calmly hit the record button to go back 5 seconds and start recording. Super handy for a long wildlife stakeout when you're waiting for some action to happen. Now let's compare the Canon R5 Mark II to the flagship R1, which I've taken more than 50,000 photos with, and the original R5 that I've probably put 500,000 photos on. As for the R1, the performance of the R5 Mark II is most of what the R1 gives you, including great autofocus, minus the bigger battery and the more robust build quality of the R1. If I was exclusively shooting at big game where I don't crop much, I'd probably pick the R1. super sticky autofocus, and a bigger battery. But where I live, the wildlife is wild, and I love shooting birds, and small birds at that, warblers and finches and kinglets at a distance. And as such, I'm always cropping, and megapixels matter for deep crops. So the R5 II's 45 megapixels are really nice for that. And I actually like the smaller form factor of the R5 Mark II's body, as it's smaller, lighter, and easier to travel with, and the autofocus system doesn't give up much, if anything, on the R1. And I don't go for that looking pro thing of having a big-bodied camera. That's not important to me at all. So that leaves me with the question, is the R5 Mark II a big enough upgrade to be worthy of replacing my original R5? It has the same great eye detection for birds, but better eye detection for mammals. It also has a usable electronic shutter with sound to accompany it, higher frame rate, and no rolling shutter. It has a better EVF, which is easier on my eyes after taking 2,000 shots in a day. And it has more video customizability and features including audio when shooting in slow motion. No overheating issues even when pushed to the limit, and newer codecs. So here's my conclusion. Flagship performance in a smaller body, a worthy successor to the already great R5. I'm getting one. I hope I've helped you get a better handle on the new Canon R5 Mark II by testing it in the field, and that I've helped you pick the best camera for you, whatever you choose. And I hope that you can go out soon and get your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.